This is HOA outplayed. She brought a clipboard and a lie. A file cart rolled past the front desk and Carol screamed that my records request was abuse and she would charge me for it. "Stop filming me and start complying," she yelled, her face going red as the clerk behind the counter froze mid-keystroke. I kept the phone steady and told her the request was public record and she could either produce the documents or explain to the state auditor why Magnolia Heights Commons Association kept losing paperwork every time someone asked a hard question. She slammed her portable rolling stamp pad on the desk like a gavel and told me I would pay for every page, every photocopy, every minute of staff time, and if I did not like it, I could take it up with her committee. I did not blink. I told her I had already taken it up with her committee, and they had deleted my appeal from the portal, and I had the timestamps to prove it. The clerk looked at Carol, then at me, then back at Carol, and I saw the exact moment she realized this was not going to be a quiet shakedown. It started 3 weeks earlier with a doorbell camera clip. I work nights as a commercial photographer, which means I sleep during the day and I always have a camera and extra batteries on me. The clip showed someone in a gray cardigan placing a violation notice on my door at 2 in the morning and walking away fast. No truck, no clipboard check, just a quick drop and sprint. The notice said I owed $300 for an unapproved exterior modification, but it did not say what the modification was or when the board voted on it. I checked my own footage from the porch cam and the driveway cam, and there was no modification. My paint was the same. My mailbox was the same. My landscaping was identical to 6 other houses on the block. I sent an email to the portal asking for clarification and the meeting minutes that authorized the fine. The reply came back in 4 hours. Carol Wilson, social committee chair, told me the fine was valid. The records were available for inspection during business hours, and if I continued to dispute it without payment, I would incur late fees and potential legal action. I called the management office and asked for an appointment to review the violation file. The woman who answered said Carol handled all violation files for the social committee, and I would need to coordinate directly with her. I sent another email. Carol replied that the file was available, but I would need to submit a formal records request under the state statute, and the association reserved the right to charge reasonable fees for staff time and copying. I wrote back and said, "Fine, I am submitting a formal records request right now for all meeting minutes, violation notices, appeal records, and enforcement logs related to my property for the past 2 years." She did not reply for 3 days. When she finally did, the email said my request was overly broad, would require extensive staff time, and I needed to narrow the scope or prepay an estimate of $450. I work nights, which means Carol kept scheduling enforcement stunts during my sleep window. The day after I submitted the narrowed request, someone knocked on my door at 9 in the morning. I stumbled out of bed and opened it to find Carol standing there with a clipboard and a measuring tape, telling me she was conducting a compliance inspection and I needed to provide access to my backyard immediately. I told her I had just gotten to sleep 3 hours earlier and she could schedule an appointment like a normal person. She said the covenants allowed unannounced inspections and if I refused she would note it as non-compliance. I told her to go ahead and note it, and I closed the door. 10 minutes later, I got an email saying I was now in violation of obstruction of HOA duties and the fine was an additional $200. I called my neighbor, a calm homeowner named Mark who had been fighting the HOA for years over selective enforcement. He told me Carol had a pattern. She would target someone, stack violations until they either paid or moved, and if they pushed back she would delete their appeals from the portal and claim they never filed. He said 3 families had left the neighborhood in the past 2 years after Carol buried them in fees and legal threats, and one of them had been fighting a case about missing HOA funds that Carol insisted was resolved, but the ledger entries never added up. I asked if he still had any of their paperwork. He said he had a binder. I told him I needed to see it. Mark came over that night and dropped a 3-inch binder on my kitchen table. Inside were printed meeting minutes, violation notices, appeal forms, and a stack of printed photos clipped together showing identical violation notices on different doors, all signed by Carol, all dated within a 2-week span 3 years ago. The photos showed the notices had no case numbers, no board vote references, and no appeal instructions. Mark said the family that left had been trying to get records to prove Carol was inventing violations to meet a tow contract quota, but the management company kept saying the records were incomplete or had been archived off-site. I flipped through the binder and saw a pattern. Every notice Carol issued had the same vague language, the same missing vote reference, and the same threat of immediate collections. I asked Mark if anyone had ever formally complained to the state. He said no, because Carol always backed off right before it got that far, and people assumed it was not worth the fight. I wrote down every word, because later I planned to read them back to her. I took photos of every page in Mark's binder and uploaded them to a cloud folder with timestamps. Then I sent another email to Carol, citing the state statute on records access and asking for the specific meeting minutes that authorized my fines, the appeal log showing my submission, and the enforcement policy that allowed unannounced inspections. I copied the management company and the board president. Carol replied within an hour. She said my request was now classified as harassment. The fees had been escalated to collections, and I was banned from submitting further portal appeals until the balance was cleared. I replied with a screenshot of the portal showing my appeal had been opened at 10:42 on a Tuesday morning. Then the access log showed it had been deleted at 10:47 from an admin account. I asked if she wanted to explain that on the record. She did not reply. Instead, I got a certified letter 2 days later saying my account was past due, collections had been initiated, and if I did not pay within 10 business days, the association would place a lien on my property. The letter was backdated by a week. I checked the postmark. It had been mailed the same day I sent the screenshot. I took photos of the envelope, the letter, and the postmark, and I uploaded them to the same cloud folder. Then I called Mark and told him I was going to the management office to demand the records in person, and I needed a witness. He said he would meet me there. The management office was in a strip mall off the main road, next to a dry cleaner and a tax prep service. I walked in with Mark and told the clerk I was there to inspect the records related to my formal request. The clerk, a young woman who looked like she would rather be anywhere else, said she would need to check with Carol. I told her Carol did not control public records access, and the statute said I had a right to inspect within 3 business days. The clerk picked up the phone and called Carol. I heard Carol's voice through the speaker, sharp and loud, telling the clerk not to let me see anything until the fees were paid. The clerk put the phone down and said she was sorry, but she had to follow the committee chair's instructions. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I told the clerk I was making a formal request under state law, and if she refused, I would file a complaint with the state auditor and copy the attorney general. The clerk's face went pale. She said she would get the records. That was when the file cart rolled past the front desk, and Carol came through the door like a storm. Her face already red, and her thin reading glasses perched on her nose for dramatic effect. She saw me holding the phone and immediately started yelling that I was violating office policy and harassing staff. I told her I was exercising my statutory right to inspect records, and she could either produce them or explain to the state why she kept blocking access. She slammed her portable rolling stamp pad on the desk and said I was abusing the process. The request was frivolous, and she would charge me for every single page. I asked her to define frivolous. She said any request designed to harass the board or waste staff time. I asked her how many other homeowners had filed records requests in the past 2 years. She said that was none of my business. I told her it was absolutely my business if she was applying the fee policy selectively, and I had evidence she was deleting appeals and backdating enforcement letters. Her face went from red to purple. She told me I was a liar, and if I continued to defame the board, she would sue me personally. I told her I had screenshots, postmarks, and a binder full of cases that looked exactly like mine. I told her I had a notary appointment booked for tomorrow, and if I missed it, my sworn statements would be delayed for weeks, so she could either hand over the records now, or I would file the complaint today and let the auditor sort it out. She stared at me for a long moment, her hand still gripping the stamp pad. Then she turned to the clerk and told her to pull my file. The clerk hesitated, glanced at me, then opened a drawer and pulled out a thin folder. Carol snatched it from her hands and flipped it open. Inside were 2 violation notices, both dated within the past month, both signed by Carol, and both missing any reference to a board vote or an appeal process. I asked Carol where the meeting minutes were. She said the minutes were in the board packet, and I would need to request those separately. I told her that was exactly what I had requested, and she had called it overly broad. She said I needed to specify which meetings. I pulled out my phone and read from my original email. I had specified every board meeting and committee meeting for the past 2 years. She said those records were archived off-site and would take weeks to retrieve. I asked her why the state statute said records had to be available within 3 business days. She said that only applied to current records. I asked her to show me where the statute said that. She did not answer. Instead, she told the clerk to make copies of the 2 notices in the file and charge me 50 cents per page plus a $20 processing fee. I told the clerk to hold off on that, and I pulled out my own folder. Inside were the screenshots, the postmarked envelope, the binder photos, and a printed timeline I had built showing Carol's pattern. I laid the timeline on the desk and walked Carol through it. 3 years ago, a homeowner named Stevens had filed a complaint about missing funds in the reserve account. Carol had issued him 4 violations in 2 weeks, all for vague exterior issues, and he had paid under threat of a lien. 2 years ago, a homeowner named Patel had questioned a vendor contract Carol pushed through without a bid process. Carol had issued her 3 violations, backdated a collections letter, and Patel had moved out. Last year, a homeowner named Kowalski had asked for the reserve fund audit, and Carol had issued him 2 violations and deleted his appeal from the portal. Kowalski had also moved out. I told Carol that every single one of those cases had the same missing meeting minutes, the same vague notices, and the same deleted appeals. I told her I had a certified statement from a former board member describing her pattern and motive, and I was going to present it as a timeline, so the facts were undeniable even to people who hated drama. Carol's hand started shaking. She told me I had no right to dig up old cases, and I was harassing former residents. I told her the former board member had reached out to me after hearing I was fighting back, and he was willing to testify that Carol had been running a shakedown operation for years, using fake violations to force out anyone who questioned her vendor contracts or her budget manipulation. She told me that was slander, and she would have me removed from the property. I asked her how she planned to do that when I owned my unit outright, and had never missed a legitimate assessment. She said the violations were legitimate and the board had voted on them. I asked her to show me the vote record. She said it was in the archived minutes. I told her I would wait. She turned to the clerk and told her to call the tow company. I asked her what that had to do with records access. She said my vehicle was parked in a guest spot and guest spots required a permit. I told her I lived here and I was parked in my assigned spot. She said the spot assignments had been updated last month and mine had been reassigned. I asked her to show me the reassignment notice. She said it was posted on the portal. I pulled up the portal on my phone and showed her my spot was still listed as assigned to me. She said the portal was not always current. I told her that was not my problem, and if she called a tow without proper authorization, I would sue her and the Association for Conversion. She hesitated, then told the clerk to hold off. Mark, who had been standing quietly beside me the whole time, finally spoke up. He told Carol he had been documenting her behavior for years, and he had the actual printed covenants with him, and he would be happy to read them out loud so everyone could hear what the rules actually said. He pulled a binder from his bag and flipped to the section on violations and appeals. He read the section that required board votes to be recorded in meeting minutes, the section that required appeal rights to be included on every notice, and the section that prohibited selective enforcement. Carol told him to shut up and stop interfering. He kept reading. The clerk was staring at Carol now, her face tight and uncomfortable. I could see the exact moment she realized she had been enabling something ugly. Carol tried a different angle. She told me that if I dropped the records request and paid the fines, she would waive the late fees and we could all move on. I told her I was not paying a single dollar until she produced the meeting minutes and the appeal log. She said those records did not exist because the violations were administrative actions that did not require board votes. I asked her to show me where the covenant said that. She said it was implied. I told her implied was not a legal standard and I would see her at the hearing. She said there was no hearing scheduled. I told her I had already requested one in writing, and if she refused to schedule it, I would file a complaint with the state and copy every homeowner in the association. Her face went pale. She told the clerk to schedule a hearing for the following week. I left the office with Mark, and we sat in my car for a minute, rain tapping on the windshield. He told me I had just backed Carol into a corner, and she was going to come at me harder now. I told him I knew, and that was why I had the certified statement and the timeline ready. I asked him if he would testify at the hearing. He said absolutely. I asked him if he knew anyone else who would. He said he knew 2 other homeowners who had been targeted by Carol, and they would probably show up if they thought it would make a difference. I told him to reach out to them and tell them this was the time. He nodded and got out of the car. I sat there for another minute watching the rain, and then I drove home and started prepping my evidence packets. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the clubhouse meeting room. I spent the week organizing my documents, printing copies for every board member, and rehearsing my presentation. Mark reached out to the two other homeowners, Stevens and Patel, and they both agreed to come. Stevens had moved out of state, but he said he would send a notarized statement. Patel still lived 2 blocks away, and she said she would testify in person. I also got a call from the former board member, a man named Greg who had resigned a year earlier after Carol blocked his attempts to audit the vendor contracts. He said he would testify that Carol had been manipulating the budget and using fake violations to silence anyone who asked questions. He said he had emails and meeting notes that proved it. 2 days before the hearing, Carol escalated again. I got a certified letter saying my violations had been sent to collections, and the association was initiating lien proceedings. The letter demanded proof in a format they had never mentioned until today. It said I needed to provide a notarized affidavit stating that no exterior modifications had been made, along with photographs taken by a licensed inspector, and the affidavit had to be submitted within 48 hours, or the lien would be filed. I called the management office and asked if they were serious. The clerk said Carol had insisted on the new requirement and it was board policy. I asked her to show me the board policy. She said she would email it to me. The email never came. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. I drafted the affidavit myself, had it notarized that afternoon, and took my own inspection photos with timestamps and GPS metadata. I submitted the packet to the portal and emailed copies to the board president and the management company. Carol replied within an hour. She said the affidavit was insufficient because it was not from a licensed inspector, and the photos were not acceptable because they did not show the property line markers. I replied and said the covenants did not require a licensed inspector, and the property line markers were not relevant to an exterior modification claim. She said the board had the discretion to set evidentiary standards. I told her discretion was not the same as making up rules after the fact, and I would bring it up at the hearing. The night before the hearing, Carol tried one more tactic. She called different tow drivers like she was speed dialing chaos. I know this because 3 different tow trucks showed up at my building between 8 and 10 at night, each driver telling me Carol had called and said my vehicle was abandoned. I showed each driver my registration, my unit assignment, and the portal screenshot showing my spot. 2 of them apologized and left. The third one, a guy in a stained jacket who looked like he had been doing this too long, told me Carol had promised him a flat fee per tow and he was not leaving without a vehicle. I told him if he hooked my car without proper authorization I would call the police and file a theft report. He told me Carol said she had authorization. I asked him to show me the written work order. He pulled out a crumpled napkin with Carol's signature and a scrawled note that said tow spot 14, no permit. I took a photo of the napkin and told him that was not a legal work order, and if he proceeded I would add him as a defendant in my lawsuit against the association. He stared at me for a long moment, then got back in his truck and drove away. I did not sleep that night. I spent the hours reviewing my evidence, double-checking my timeline, and running through my presentation. Mark texted me at 6 in the morning and said Patel and Greg were both confirmed for the hearing. I texted back and said I was ready. At 4 in the afternoon, I loaded my evidence packets into a messenger bag and drove to the clubhouse. The parking lot was already half full. I recognized a few neighbors, including a mail carrier I had seen trying to get around the crowd at the mailbox cluster a few weeks earlier. Inside, the meeting room was set up with a long table at the front for the board and rows of folding chairs for residents. Carol was already there, sitting at the table with her portable rolling stamp pad in front of her and a stack of papers beside her. She saw me walk in, and her expression went cold. The board president, a tired-looking man in his 60s named Donald, called the meeting to order at 6:30. He said we were there to hear my appeal of the violation notices and the collections action. He asked Carol to present the association's case. Carol stood up and launched into a speech about how I had been uncooperative, hostile, and abusive towards staff, and how my records requests were designed to harass the board and waste resources. She said the violations were clear, the notices were proper, and I had refused to comply. She said the board had the authority to enforce the covenants and my behavior was undermining the community. She finished by saying the board should uphold the fines, proceed with collections, and consider additional sanctions for my harassment of staff. Donald asked me if I wanted to respond. I stood up and walked to the front of the room with my messenger bag. I told the board I had prepared evidence packets for each of them, and I would walk them through the timeline. I handed out the packets and opened mine to the first page. I told them the violations were fake, the meeting minutes did not exist, and Carol had been running a pattern of selective enforcement for years to silence anyone who questioned her budget manipulation and vendor contracts. Carol interrupted and said that was a lie and I had no proof. I told her I had screenshots, postmarks, binder photos, and a certified statement from a former board member. I told her I was going to present it as a timeline, so the facts were undeniable even to people who hated drama. I walked the board through the timeline. I showed them the doorbell camera clip of Carol planting the notice at 2 in the morning. I showed them the violation notices with no case numbers, no vote references, and no appeal instructions. I showed them the portal log screenshot proving my appeal had been deleted from an admin account. I showed them the backdated collections letter with the postmark proving it was mailed the same day I submitted my evidence. I showed them the binder photos from Mark's collection, showing the same pattern in 3 other cases. I showed them the certified statement from Greg, the former board member, describing how Carol had blocked his audit attempts and manipulated vendor contracts to benefit her friends. I finished by showing them the crumpled napkin the tow driver had shown me the night before, with Carol's signature authorizing a tow without a valid work order. The room was dead silent. Donald stared at the evidence packet in front of him, his face pale. The other board members were flipping through their copies, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. Carol's face had gone from red to white. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. Donald looked at her and asked if she wanted to respond to the allegations. She said the timeline was misleading and I had taken everything out of context. Donald asked her to explain the deleted appeal. She said it was a technical glitch. Donald asked her to explain the backdated collections letter. She said the mailing date was an error. Donald asked her to explain the napkin. She said the tow driver had misunderstood her instructions. Donald looked at her for a long moment, then looked at the rest of the board. He said they needed to go into executive session to discuss the matter. The board left the room, and the residents started talking. Mark came up to me and said I had just dropped a bomb on Carol and there was no way she was walking away from this. Patel, who had been sitting in the back, came forward and told me she wished she had fought back when Carol targeted her. She said Carol had made her life miserable for 6 months, and she had moved out just to escape it. Greg, the former board member, told me he was glad someone finally called Carol out, and he hoped the board would do the right thing. I told them I appreciated their support, and I would let them know how it turned out. The board came back 20 minutes later. Donald looked grim. He said the board had reviewed the evidence and they had serious concerns about the violation process and the records handling. He said the board was suspending all pending violations and collections actions against me, effective immediately. He said the board was launching an internal audit of the violation files and the vendor contracts. He said the board was referring the matter to the association's attorney for a legal review. And he said Carol Wilson was being removed from her position as social committee chair, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the audit. Carol stood up and said she would not accept that. Donald told her she did not have a choice. She said she would sue the board for defamation. Donald told her she was welcome to try, but the evidence was clear and the board had a fiduciary duty to investigate. Carol's smug smile vanished when the room turned on her. One of the residents in the back stood up and said she had been fined by Carol last year for a mailbox violation that turned out to be the wrong address. Another resident said Carol had threatened to tow his guest's car even though the guest had a valid permit. A third resident said Carol had blocked her records request about the reserve fund and told her it was none of her business. The room erupted in overlapping complaints and angry questions. Donald banged his gavel and told everyone to calm down. He said the board would address all concerns as part of the audit. Carol tried to speak again, but Donald cut her off. He told her the meeting was adjourned and she needed to leave the property. She grabbed her stamp pad and her papers and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Mark and I stayed behind to talk to the other residents. Patel told me she was filing a formal complaint with the state about her old violations. Greg told me he was going to provide all his emails and notes to the board's attorney. Stevens, who had sent his notarized statement, called me later that night and said he was considering a lawsuit for the fees he had paid under duress. I told them all to document everything and keep copies of everything, because Carol was not going to go quietly. Mark asked me if I thought the board would follow through. I told him I did not know, but I had done everything I could to force their hand. The next morning, I got an email from Donald saying the board had retained an outside attorney to conduct the audit, and they expected the process to take 4 to 6 weeks. He said the attorney would be reaching out to me for an interview. He also said the board was suspending all new violation enforcement until the audit was complete, and they were reviewing the vendor contracts Carol had authorized. I replied and said I appreciated the update, and I would cooperate fully with the audit. I also said I expected a full refund of any fees I had been charged, plus reimbursement for my notary costs and my time spent fighting the fake violations. Donald replied and said that would be determined after the audit. 2 weeks later, the attorney called me. Her name was Lisa, and she was a partner at a firm that specialized in HOA disputes. She asked me to walk her through the entire timeline and provide copies of all my evidence. I spent 2 hours on the phone with her, going through every document, every screenshot, every email, and every interaction. She asked detailed questions about Carol's behavior, the portal deletions, the backdated letters, and the tow incidents. She also asked about the other cases I had referenced. I gave her contact information for Mark, Patel, Stevens, and Greg. She said she would follow up with all of them. 3 weeks after that, I got a call from Donald. He said the audit was complete and the findings were damning. The attorney had confirmed that Carol had been issuing fake violations for years, deleting appeals from the portal, backdating enforcement letters, and manipulating vendor contracts to steer business to companies that gave her kickbacks. The attorney had also found evidence that Carol had been skimming money from the social committee budget by submitting false expense reports. The total amount was over $15,000. Donald said the board had voted unanimously to terminate Carol's membership on all committees, ban her from holding any future board positions, and refer the matter to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. He also said the board was terminating the contracts with the tow company and the management company because both had enabled Carol's behavior. He said the board was issuing full refunds to me and the other homeowners who had been targeted, plus reimbursement for legal costs and notary fees. I asked Donald what the total refund amount was. He said it was over $40,000 across all the affected homeowners. I asked him how the board planned to pay that. He said they were using the reserve fund and they were filing an insurance claim against the management company for negligence. He also said the board was calling a special meeting in 2 weeks to discuss the findings and allow residents to ask questions. I told him I would be there. The special meeting was packed. Every folding chair was taken and people were standing in the back. Donald opened the meeting by summarizing the audit findings. He said Carol had violated the covenants, the bylaws, and state law. He said the board had failed to provide adequate oversight, and they took full responsibility. He said the board was implementing new policies to prevent future abuse, including quarterly audits, mandatory board training, and a resident oversight committee. He also said Carol had been notified of the findings and had resigned from the association entirely. She was moving out of the neighborhood within 60 days. The residents started asking questions. One man asked if Carol would face criminal charges. Donald said the district attorney was reviewing the case and he could not comment further. A woman asked if the board members who had enabled Carol would resign. Donald said 2 board members had already resigned and he was considering stepping down himself after the transition. Another man asked if the new policies would prevent selective enforcement. Donald said that was the goal, and the Oversight Committee would have the authority to review any violation before it was issued. Mark stood up and asked if the board would commit to transparency going forward. Donald said absolutely, and the board would start posting meeting minutes and financial reports on the portal within 30 days. I stood up and said I appreciated the board's response, but I wanted to make sure everyone understood what had happened. I said Carol had targeted me and at least 4 other homeowners with fake violations, deleted appeals, backdated letters, and intimidation tactics, all to silence anyone who questioned her budget manipulation and vendor kickbacks. I said the board had failed to catch it because they had trusted Carol and they had not asked hard questions. I said the new policies were a good start, but the real solution was for residents to stay engaged, ask questions, and hold the board accountable. The room erupted in applause. Donald nodded and said I was right. After the meeting, several residents came up to me and thanked me for fighting back. Patel told me she was getting a full refund of the fees she had paid, and she was considering moving back to the neighborhood. Stevens called me the next day and said he was getting a refund too, and he was filing a complaint with the State Real Estate Commission about the management company. Greg told me he was glad the board had finally taken action, and he hoped the new policies would stick. Mark told me I had just changed the neighborhood forever, and he was proud to have been part of it. 2 weeks later, I got a check in the mail for $1,800, covering my refunded fees, my notary costs, and reimbursement for my time. I deposited it and sent a thank you email to Donald. He replied and said the board appreciated my patience and my willingness to pursue the matter. He also said the district attorney had decided to file charges against Carol for theft and fraud, and the case was moving forward. I replied and said I was glad to hear it. A month after that, I ran into the mail carrier at the mailbox cluster. She told me she had heard about the audit and the refunds, and she was glad someone had finally stood up to Carol. She said Carol had been rude to her for years and had once threatened to have her fired for delivering mail too slowly. I told her Carol was gone now and the neighborhood was better for it. She smiled and said she noticed. 6 months later, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. The new oversight committee had reviewed every active violation and dismissed half of them as improperly issued. The board had renegotiated the vendor contracts and saved the association over $20,000 a year. The reserve fund audit showed the association was in better financial shape than anyone had thought, once the skimmed money was accounted for. And Carol was gone. Her unit sold in 3 weeks, and the new owners were quiet, polite, and had no interest in board politics. Donald stepped down as board president after the transition, and the residents elected a new board that included Mark and 2 other homeowners who had been targeted by Carol. The new board passed a resolution formally apologizing to everyone who had been affected by Carol's abuse and committing to transparency and accountability. They also passed a policy requiring all violation notices to include case numbers, meeting vote references, and clear appeal instructions. And they passed a rule that no single person could control the portal or the records system. I stayed involved for a while, attending meetings and keeping an eye on the new board, but after a year I stepped back. The neighborhood was stable, the board was functional, and the oversight committee was doing its job. I did not need to be the watchdog anymore. I went back to my normal life, working nights and sleeping days, and I did not think about Carol or the HOA drama much after that. But every once in a while I would get an email or a phone call from someone in the neighborhood, thanking me for what I had done. Or I would see Mark at the mailbox cluster, and he would tell me about the latest board meeting and how smoothly things were running. And I would remember that cold morning when the file cart rolled past the front desk and Carol screamed that my records request was abuse, and I would smile. Because I had stood my ground, I had gathered my evidence, I had forced the board to act, and I had won. The payoff was a vendor termination that cut off her favorite enforcement muscle, and the HOA dropped the case to avoid a public records mess. Her bluff got read out loud and the room reacted, and her carefully constructed scam collapsed under the weight of her own contradictions. The neighborhood where curb appeal matters more than reality had learned a hard lesson about accountability, and I had learned that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to shine a light on what they are doing and refuse to back down. Thanks for watching, and I will be back soon.